Naomi sat at the dining table, her fingers gliding slowly over the neatly arranged silverware around her. Her expression was serene, but inside she absorbed every detail of the environment. The yellow light from the hallway crept into the room, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Behind the kitchen door, muffled voices conversed. "We need to be quick," whispered Richard, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night like a blade. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the voices, feigning confusion, but kept her face blank. Pretending was her greatest defense. Soon, Richard entered the room, a rigid smile etched onto his face. He carried a glass of water, placing it before her with mechanical delicacy. "You must be thirsty," he said, his voice so controlled it almost sounded genuine. "Thank you," Naomi replied softly but firmly. Groping the table, she picked up the glass. She felt Richard's presence linger for a second longer than necessary. When he finally moved away, she relaxed her shoulders just enough to remain imperceptible. Fiona appeared shortly after, brushing close to Naomi's chair on purpose. Her shoulder grazed Naomi's in a subtle, yet intrusive gesture. Naomi remained still, her gaze lost in some point in the distance. "Do you need anything else, dear?" Fiona asked, the sweetness in her voice contrasting sharply with the rigidity of her touch. Naomi shook her head slowly. "No, I'm fine." Fiona hesitated for a moment before stepping away, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Naomi tracked her movements with her ears, noting the irregular and hesitant rhythm, as if Fiona wanted to ensure she stayed quiet. The tension in the house was palpable. Naomi knew she was being watched, analyzed, tested with every gesture. Richard and Fiona underestimated her awareness, but she took in everything. She stood up slowly, feigning uncertainty, letting the cane tap softly against the floor with each step. The sound was a steady, firm rhythm that seemed to cut through the oppressive silence of the house. In the hallway, yellow light seeped through the kitchen door left ajar. Naomi heard more whispers. "She can't know," Fiona murmured. "It won't be a problem," Richard replied. "Tomorrow, we'll take the first step." Naomi froze for a moment, holding her breath. Controlling herself, she stumbled slightly, letting the cane tap against the wall with a faint click. The whispers immediately ceased. She continued forward without hesitation, though the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. As she passed the pantry, she felt a presence behind the partially open door. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but the sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. She pressed on, focused on maintaining her facade of vulnerability, until she reached the staircase. Naomi began to climb the steps slowly, one hand on the railing and the other holding the cane. She maintained her balance carefully, her movements calculated to appear clumsy. At the top of the stairs, she turned for a moment, as if trying to listen for something below. In the distance, Richard entered the room, crossed his arms, and shot Fiona a sharp look. "We need to do this soon, before she catches on," he said, his voice filled with frustration. Climbing the final step, Naomi felt a shiver run down her spine. In her bedroom, she closed the door gently, pressing her forehead against the cool wood for a moment. Her heart raced, but her mind was clear. On the other side of the door, Fiona spoke with the same cutting softness as always. "Tomorrow, we'll bring the document. She'll sign it, blind or not." In the silence of her room, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, staring intently at the drawer beside her. Darkness was comforting to her, a disguise that had long become second nature. With a hesitant hand, she opened the drawer and touched the objects inside, small devices she had been keeping for months. Among them were micro cameras and USB drives she had secretly purchased weeks before regaining her sight. The light in her world was still dim, as if she were looking through fogged glass, but it was enough. She could see shapes, colors, movement. It was enough to unveil betrayal. Taking a deep breath, Naomi stood and walked to the window. The curtains were only partially drawn, allowing the moonlight to illuminate the garden outside. She saw the silhouette of Mr. Fisher, the gardener, moving slowly as he arranged tools on a small bench. He seemed oblivious to what was happening inside the house, to the danger lurking within. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, as if to etch that moment of calmness in her memory, before turning to look at the interior of her room. She needed to act. Clutching the cameras firmly, she left her room on silent steps. The wooden floor creaked slightly, but the sound was muffled by the carpet in the hallway. Naomi moved cautiously, avoiding areas she knew would make noise. The hallway was empty, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Naomi paused at the entrance to the living room and glanced around. The space was empty, but the table still held the papers Fiona had been handling earlier. Further back, the lights in the study were on. Approaching slowly, Naomi hid the first camera in a corner of the living room near the frame of a painting. It was discreet enough to go unnoticed. Then, she adjusted another camera in the hallway, positioning it behind a tall plant. The sound of voices made her stop. She needs to sign this soon. We can't wait any longer, Fiona said, impatience evident in her tone. I know, Richard replied, a calculated edge in his voice. But we can't do anything that would raise suspicion. Naomi leaned against the wall, listening intently to every word. If she finds out beforehand, everything falls apart, Fiona continued. Don't worry, Richard said. She has no way of finding out. By tomorrow, with the contract signed, the house will be ours. After that, we just deal with her. A chill ran down Naomi's spine. They weren't speaking like people concerned about her welfare. They were conspirators, plotting a way to eliminate an obstacle. With light steps, Naomi returned to her room. She sat on the bed again, her mind spinning. The pieces of the puzzle were all there. They wanted the house. They wanted to get rid of her. And now she knew she had little time to act. Grabbing her hidden laptop, she connected one of the USB drives and reviewed the initial recordings. Even without clear audio, the images spoke for themselves. Fiona and Richard gestured over the papers, their actions clearly indicating something was being schemed. Naomi gripped the USB drive tightly in her hand. The only advantage she had was that they believed she still couldn't see. That was her trump card. At dawn, Naomi took care to maintain her routine. She sat at the kitchen table as Richard entered, whistling softly. He placed a cup of tea in front of her, his expression light, but his eyes always watching her with caution. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice polished. "Yes, thank you," Naomi replied, trying to sound as indifferent as possible. Fiona entered shortly after, impeccably dressed as always. She wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're ready for today," Fiona said, helping herself to coffee. "Ready?" Naomi tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Yes," Fiona replied. "We need to resolve a few important things. For your own good, of course." Naomi didn't respond immediately. Instead, she ran her fingers along the edge of the teacup, as if lost in thought. But inside, her mind was racing. "And what are these important things?" she finally asked, her voice laced with false innocence. Richard and Fiona exchanged a quick glance, but Naomi pretended not to notice. "Just some documents," Richard said, smiling. Nothing for you to worry about. All right, Naomi nodded, agreeing, but inside, the urgency grew. While they spoke in hushed tones in the hallway, Naomi got up and walked down the corridor. She pretended to stumble slightly against a vase, the sound echoing through the house. Richard appeared immediately, his expression rigid. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a bit too hurried. "Yes, I just got disoriented," Naomi replied, maintaining the fragile demeanor she knew he expected. Richard stepped away, but before leaving, he gave her a cold look. Naomi returned to her room, clenching her hands by her sides. Everything was nearly ready. She knew she would need every ounce of courage to face the following day. From the other side of the door, she heard Fiona say, "Tomorrow morning, the ambulance comes. She'll be out of here before lunch." Naomi woke up to the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel. Her heart raced before her eyes even opened. The faint morning light filtered through the window, casting a grayish hue across the room. She couldn't tell if the sound announced the arrival of the ambulance or just another routine delivery, but she couldn't afford to take any chances. Slipping on her robe carefully, she opened the bedroom door and descended the stairs slowly. Each step felt heavier, more ominous. As she neared the living room, voices drifted from the hallway. Richard was on the phone, speaking in a low but firm tone. "Yes, it'll be today. I need everything ready." The confirmation made her pause on the last step. She gripped her cane tightly, controlling her breathing. The game was starting, and she needed to take control before it was too late. Naomi entered the living room as though nothing was amiss, feeling Richard's eyes on her immediately. He hung up the phone hastily, forcing a smile as he saw her. "Good morning, dear," he said, approaching her with slow, deliberate steps. "I hope you slept well." "I did," Naomi replied, feigning distraction. Her fingers brushed against the table, where a stack of papers rested next to a pen. "What's this?" Richard hesitated for a moment but quickly regained his composure. "Oh, just something that needs to be taken care of. A contract to protect you, actually. To ensure you have everything you need." Naomi let her fingers glide along the edge of the papers, pretending uncertainty. "And why the rush?" "It's just a formality," Richard answered swiftly, though the slight tremor in his voice didn't escape her notice. Fiona entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee, her smile dripping with false sweetness. "You know how it is, Naomi. Bureaucratic processes can be slow. It's best to handle everything while we have time." Naomi tilted her head, as if considering Fiona's words. "I see," she said softly. "May I know more details?" Richard and Fiona exchanged a quick glance, and Richard was the first to speak. "It's just a contract authorizing your temporary admission. You know, in case you need more intensive care. It's for your own good." "Admission?" Naomi raised an eyebrow, her expression a perfect mask of confusion. "I don't recall us discussing that." "It's something new," Fiona said, trying to sound casual. "A precaution?" Naomi felt the weight of the lie, but maintained her composure. "May I read the contract?" Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course, but there's no need to worry about the details. We're here to take care of you." "Even so," Naomi insisted, holding the pen but not rushing her movements. "I like to know what I'm signing." Richard stepped closer, his expression hardening slightly. "You trust me, don't you?" Naomi looked up at him, letting her face show a mix of hesitation and acceptance. "Of course," she said, placing the pen back on the table. Fiona sighed and stood abruptly. "I'll get more coffee," she announced, heading to the kitchen, clearly impatient. With Fiona out of the room, Naomi saw her chance. "Richard," she said, turning her head toward him, "do you think I'll need to be away from home for long?" Richard hesitated, his words coming out slower. "Well, that depends on what the doctors recommend. It's just that I love it here so much," Naomi continued, letting a slight tremble creep into her voice. "I don't know how I'd feel if I couldn't come back." Richard forced a smile. "Don't worry. Everything will be resolved for the best." Naomi intentionally dropped the pen. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, leaning down to retrieve it. As she bent, she caught the faint creak of the wooden floor behind her. Fiona was back, standing at the door with an irritated expression. "You're taking too long," Fiona said, crossing her arms. "I was just explaining to Naomi," Richard replied, forcing a soothing tone. Naomi straightened up with the pen in hand and placed it gently on the table. "I'm feeling a bit tired," she said in a low voice. "May I rest before signing?" Fiona opened her mouth to protest, but Richard raised a hand, signaling her to stay calm. "Of course, dear. Go ahead and rest. We'll sign later." Naomi nodded, turning slowly and walking toward the stairs. She felt their eyes burning into her back, but maintained a calm pace. Climbing the steps, each movement was deliberate. Once inside her room, she slid her hand to her waist, where a small USB drive was hidden. A faint smile crossed her lips. Every second she gained was a victory, and she knew their time was running out. As she whispered to herself, Naomi's resolve hardened. They won't have time to celebrate. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone on the table beside her. No response. The message sent to Detective Miller hours earlier was still marked as delivered, but not read. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The clock beside her read just past midnight, and the house was steeped in a tense silence, interrupted only by occasional footsteps in the hallway. She knew Fiona was out there, pacing back and forth impatiently. Her presence was almost tangible, like a constant shadow. Naomi reached into her pocket and clenched the USB drive tightly. Her only chance rested in that small device, and the uncertainty of whether it would be enough made her stomach churn. Outside the door, the footsteps stopped. Naomi froze, listening intently. When the sound resumed, it was closer. The doorknob turned slightly, but the door was locked. Fiona let out a frustrated sigh, followed by the sound of something being dragged along the hallway. Naomi knew Fiona was anxious. Perhaps it was a good sign. Nervous people make mistakes, but time was cruelly short. The ambulance was coming in the morning, and she needed something solid before then. With the phone still in hand, she checked the recordings on the app connected to the hidden cameras. The videos showed Fiona in the office earlier, rifling through papers with an annoyed expression. Richard came and went, constantly glancing around as if expecting to be caught. Naomi turned up the volume and managed to catch part of a conversation. "She needs to sign before the ambulance gets here," Fiona said sharply. "I know," Richard replied, "but she's suspicious." "We need to be careful." Naomi pressed her lips together, feeling her anxiety rise. Would that evidence be enough to catch the police's attention? Or was it already too late? Tired of waiting, she decided to leave the room. She grabbed the cane to maintain appearances and opened the door slowly. The hallway was dark, but Fiona's receding footsteps indicated she had gone downstairs. Moving carefully, Naomi headed toward the kitchen. She pretended to feel her way along the walls, her fingertips brushing every surface like a blind person might. When she reached the stairs, she hesitated. "I need some water," she said, her voice intentionally unsteady. Suddenly, Fiona appeared at the top of the stairs, her face partially obscured by shadows. "You should be resting," she said, with a smile that barely concealed her coldness. "I just wanted a glass of water," Naomi replied calmly. "I'll get it for you," Fiona said, stepping down a single stair. Her tone was overly sweet, almost saccharine, but her movements had a predatory edge. Naomi shook her head. "I'd rather get it myself. I need to stretch a little." She took a step forward, but Fiona remained in the way. The two women exchanged a tense look, even though Fiona believed Naomi couldn't see her. "Be careful on the stairs," Fiona said, finally stepping aside with a smile that barely masked her disdain. Naomi continued descending, each step meticulously calculated. When she reached the bottom, she turned toward the hallway and entered the kitchen. The dim light of a single bulb illuminated the space, casting shadows on the walls. As she filled a glass of water, Naomi noticed movement in the living room. Fiona was standing at the base of the stairs, her expression hard, arms crossed. "Do you need anything else?" Fiona asked, her tone dripping with impatience. "No, thank you," Naomi replied, turning slowly and heading toward the hallway. As she passed Fiona, she felt a sudden movement behind her. Fiona tried to push her, but Naomi was prepared. She grabbed onto the banister, dodging the shove. Fiona lunged again, this time trying to grab her arm. Naomi reacted instinctively. She turned and used her cane to push Fiona back. The woman stumbled, hitting her knee on the lower step. A groan of pain escaped Fiona, but her face was twisted with anger. "You're more resilient than I thought," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm just trying to stay on my feet," Naomi replied, feigning confusion as her hands trembled. The commotion drew Richard, who hurried down the stairs. He looked at Fiona, then at Naomi, and frowned. "What's going on here?" "She almost knocked me over," Fiona said, panting. "It was an accident," Naomi said softly. "I slipped." Richard stared at her for a long moment before sighing. "Go back to your room, Naomi. You need to rest." She nodded slowly, climbing the stairs as she felt their eyes boring into her back. Once inside her room, she locked the door and let out a shaky sigh. Each confrontation left her more exhausted, but also more determined. Leaning against the wall, Naomi listened to the conversation happening just outside in the hallway. "If she doesn't sign, we'll sedate her," Richard said, his tone low but firm. "The clinic will take her under sedation." Naomi clenched her fist against the wall, a lump forming in her throat. They weren't going to give up, and time was running against her. "If I don't get help by morning, I'll have to fight this battle alone." Naomi sat on her bed, her face weary, clutching her phone. The email icon remained unchanged. No responses. Detective Miller hadn't replied, and the lack of news was a growing shadow in her heart. She tried to steady her breathing, but the clock beside her seemed to conspire against her calm, each second echoing like a hammer blow. The house was wrapped in silence, except for muffled voices coming from downstairs. Richard and Fiona were arguing again, but now the tone was sharper, more urgent. Naomi tilted her head to listen more closely. "If she doesn't sign, we already know what to do," Richard said, his voice tense. "And if there's no time," Fiona replied, impatient, "we need to make sure this ends tonight." Naomi gripped the flash drive in her hand, the metallic chill grounding her amidst the storm she was about to face. Her mind scrambled for alternatives, but the isolation suffocated her. Other than the message she had sent to the detective, there was no one else to turn to. A sound in the backyard caught her attention. Naomi went to the window and peeked through the curtain. The pale moonlight illuminated Mr. Fisher, the gardener, tidying his tools at a small wooden workbench. He seemed so oblivious to the tension inside the house that, for a moment, Naomi envied the simplicity of his routine. If only he knew, she whispered to herself. The silence was broken by a faint knock at her bedroom door. Naomi froze, but didn't respond. After a few seconds, she heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. She had no doubt that Fiona was checking to ensure she was still in the room. Naomi had to act. Clutching the flash drive, she walked to her desk and opened the drawer. Inside were recordings from the previous day, her evidence. She knew that if she were caught with it, everything would end. But if she didn't use it, she was just as doomed. Carefully, she sat back down on the bed and connected the flash drive to her phone. She selected clips of recorded conversations, especially those where Richard and Fiona mentioned the committal and the house, and attached them to the email already sent to the detective. She made sure to include a short but clear message. Evidence attached. Please help before it's too late. When she hit send, a weight lifted from her shoulders, but the anxiety soon returned. What if he didn't see it in time? Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus. Richard's words echoed in her mind. If she doesn't sign, we'll drug her. She needed to buy more time. Determined, she opened the door cautiously and stepped into the hallway. Pretending to be disoriented, she let her cane knock against the wall, creating a faint noise that echoed through the house. From downstairs, she heard Richard's voice. What was that? I'll check, Fiona replied, irritated. Naomi headed toward the kitchen. The light was off, but she knew exactly where everything was. By the time Fiona appeared in the doorway, Naomi was already holding a glass, pretending to fill it with water. You shouldn't be wandering around, Fiona said, crossing her arms and leaning against the door frame. I just needed some water, Naomi replied, her voice low and hesitant. Fiona didn't move, simply watching Naomi for a few seconds. The silence was uncomfortable, but Naomi stayed calm, taking a sip of water as if she couldn't feel the tension. Well, Fiona finally said, her tone calculated, go back to your room. You need to rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. Naomi nodded and started to leave, but deliberately stumbled, letting the glass fall to the floor. Water spilled across the carpet, and Fiona let out a deep sigh, clearly annoyed. Sorry, Naomi said, bending down to pick up the pieces of glass. As she did, she felt Fiona's gaze burning into her back. Leave it, Fiona said at last. I'll clean it up. Naomi stood, feigning confusion. You're so kind. I'm a little tired. Go rest, Fiona replied impatiently. Naomi returned to the hallway and slowly climbed the stairs. Her heart was racing, but she didn't let it show. Once inside her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky sigh. At that moment, a distant sound caught her attention. She ran to the window and saw flashing lights in the distance. Blue and red. Sirens. For a moment, her heart leapt. The police. But then, doubt crept in. It could be the ambulance, arriving earlier than expected. Naomi clenched her fists at her sides, her mind spinning. She looked at the lights again, which seemed to be approaching slowly. If these lights aren't salvation, I don't have much time left. The room was dimly lit, the weak glow of a lamp in the corner casting shadows that seemed alive. Naomi sat on the couch, her hands resting on her lap, feigning a calmness she didn't feel. Across from her, Richard stood holding the contract. His face displayed forced patience, but his eyes betrayed a growing urgency. "Naomi," he began with a strained smile, "we need to settle this now. It's for your own good." She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to pick up on the undertone in his voice. The pen lay on the table in front of her, next to the contract. The document seemed to scream, its presence oppressive. "Can you explain again what I'm signing?" Naomi asked in a low, hesitant voice. Richard sighed, clearly irritated by the delay, but he sat beside her, pointing to the document. "It's just an authorization, a guarantee that you'll get the best medical care possible. It's a protocol, nothing more." Naomi ran her fingers along the edge of the paper, as if trying to absorb its meaning through touch. "And? Will I still live here afterward?" Richard hesitated, and it was at that moment Fiona entered the room briskly, carrying a cup of tea. "Naomi," she said with a forced smile, "this is for your own good. You trust us, don't you?" Naomi nodded slowly, picking up the pen, but as she tried to grip it, she let it slip intentionally. She leaned down to retrieve it, buying herself precious seconds. When she straightened, her fingers still hovered hesitantly over the contract. "I'm just tired," she said softly. Fiona huffed, crossing her arms. "We're all tired, Naomi. Let's get this over with." Before Naomi could respond, the doorbell rang, breaking the rising tension. The sound echoed through the house, drawing all three of their gazes to the door. "Who could that be at this hour?" Fiona muttered, her voice laced with irritation. "I'll check," she said quickly, heading to the door. Naomi watched as Fiona peeked through the window beside it. Her face paled slightly upon recognizing who was outside. "It's the clinic team," Fiona announced, turning back to Richard. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine, but kept her expression neutral. "The clinic team?" she asked, feigning curiosity. "Yes," Richard replied, trying to sound calm. "They're here to ensure everything is in order." Naomi placed the pen on the table, her hand trembling slightly. I'm ready for whatever they need." Richard gave her a confused look, clearly caught off guard by her sudden compliance. He didn't realize that every move she made was calculated. "Good," he said, picking up the contract and placing it before her again. Before he could press her further, Naomi nudged a chair slightly, creating a small disturbance in the tight space. Fiona re-entered the room, shutting the door firmly behind her. "They want to come in now," she said, her tone urgent. "Wait," Richard replied, standing up and hastily organizing the papers on the table with quick, nervous movements. Taking advantage of the distraction, Naomi stood up slowly, maintaining her fragile demeanor. Fiona stepped forward to grab her arm, but Naomi took a step back, causing Fiona to stumble over one of the chairs. "Easy," Naomi said, her voice a mix of fragility and firmness. Richard turned to the two women, his face flushed with frustration. "You two, stop it!" Fiona straightened herself, her face twisted in anger. But before she could retort, a sound came from the garden. Footsteps, hurried and purposeful, as if more people were approaching. "Did you hear that?" Fiona asked, her eyes wide. Richard didn't answer immediately, but his expression showed concern. He walked to the window, opened it slightly, and peered outside. "It's not just the clinic," he murmured gravely. "There are more people out there." Naomi clutched the flash drive in the pocket of her robe, feeling sweat trickle down the back of her neck. Her mind raced, trying to anticipate what would happen next. "Richard, we need to act now," Fiona said, struggling to mask her panic. Naomi stepped forward, drawing their attention. "Did you hear those footsteps out there?" she asked, with a faint smile. "It might not be what you're expecting." The tension in the room was suffocating. Richard stared at Fiona, who had hastily closed the curtains, plunging the room into a deeper shadow. Naomi stood near the table, feeling the weight of the lies and the urgency emanating from the other two. Outside, the clinic staff waited. Footsteps echoed in the garden, but the two conspirators remained focused on hiding whatever they could before someone entered the house. "Close the windows, too," Richard ordered, running a nervous hand through his hair. Fiona rushed to the kitchen, and the sound of drawers opening and slamming shut echoed throughout the house. Naomi stayed where she was, motionless, her gaze tracking Richard as he rifled through papers, attempting to impose order on the chaos they'd created. "You're awfully quiet," Richard said, turning his suspicious eyes to Naomi. She tilted her head, feigning uncertainty. I don't know what's going on." "Why are you both so nervous?" Richard froze for a moment, squinting at her as if deciding whether to trust her words. He seemed about to speak, but Fiona returned, clutching a laptop with a pale, panicked expression. "I need to destroy this," Fiona said, holding the device like a ticking time bomb. "Then do it," Richard snapped, shifting his attention back to Naomi. Naomi took a small step back, crossing her arms to hide the slight tremor in her hands. "What exactly are you two trying to hide?" Richard let out a humorless laugh, short and cold. "Don't be ridiculous. This has nothing to do with you." She held his gaze, letting a faint smile play on her lips. "Oh, but it does, doesn't it? The contract, the clinic, the lies. I know everything." The silence following her statement was sharp and cutting. Richard froze, stunned for a moment, while Fiona, poised to smash the laptop against the wall, stopped mid-motion. "What did you say?" Richard asked, his voice low and dangerous. Naomi took another step back, maintaining her calm facade even as her heart raced. "I know about the contract. I know you want to have me committed. I know what you both are." Fiona shot a panicked look at Richard, who seemed to be processing Naomi's words. He stepped closer to her, like a predator closing in on prey. "You're delusional," he murmured, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Let me help you." "I don't need your help," Naomi replied firmly. "I see perfectly well what's going on." Unable to restrain herself, Fiona shouted, "She's lying! She doesn't know anything!" "Really?" Naomi arched an eyebrow, locking eyes with Fiona. "If I can't see, then why am I looking right at you now?" Fiona's face turned ashen. Naomi's words hit her like a slap, and she staggered back, letting the laptop fall to the floor with a dull thud. Richard, however, stood frozen, staring into Naomi's eyes as if trying to decipher her. Before he could react, a noise outside drew everyone's attention. Voices rose, and the metallic sound of something being forced against the door echoed through the house. "Police! Open the door!" Panic engulfed the room. Fiona bolted to the office, screaming, "We need to burn everything." Richard grabbed Naomi's arm in a vice-like grip, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, making it clear she wasn't afraid. "You did this," he hissed through gritted teeth. "No, you did this," Naomi shot back. Richard let go of her abruptly and ran after Fiona, who was already tearing through papers and knocking over objects in the office. Naomi lingered for a moment, listening to the sound of the front door straining under the force. She walked to the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. The scene in the office was chaos. Fiona was on her knees, shredding documents, while Richard frantically searched through drawers. "Be quick!" he shouted at Fiona. "They can't find anything." Taking advantage of their distraction, Naomi slipped into the kitchen. She knew there were hidden cameras there, cameras that had captured everything. Even if Fiona destroyed the documents, the recordings were safe, far beyond their reach. The sound of breaking glass in the office drew Naomi back to the living room. She watched as Richard, sweating and breathless, scanned the room like a cornered animal searching for an escape. "There are footsteps outside," he muttered, fear thick in his voice. Naomi allowed herself a faint smile. "Do you hear those footsteps? It might not be what you're expecting." The voices outside grew louder, and the door creaked again under the crowbar's pressure. "Police! Open the door, or we'll force our way in." Richard darted toward the back door, only to run straight into Mr. Fisher in the hallway. The gardener stood firm, holding a rake, his expression both perplexed and resolute. He blocked the passage without uttering a word. Richard came to an abrupt halt, with Fiona right behind him. Naomi stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the scene unfold with unsettling calm. Outside, Detective Miller's voice boomed, "Open the door, or we're coming in!" The front door finally gave way with a resounding crash, and police officers stormed into the house with weapons drawn, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Naomi watched from the top of the staircase, taking deep breaths to quell her rising anxiety. The room, previously steeped in tension, was now filled with sharp commands and the echo of heavy boots. "Everyone, freeze!" a commanding voice ordered as the officers fanned out across the house. Richard raised his hands immediately, struggling to maintain an innocent expression. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a shaky smile. Fiona stood further back, her disheveled hair framing a face of panic as she clutched a partially destroyed laptop. "We didn't do anything wrong!" she exclaimed, her voice teetering on hysteria. Naomi descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing ominously on the wooden boards, a reminder that she was no longer a passive observer. She had waited for this moment. It was time to reveal everything. "Ms. Naomi?" Detective Miller's voice cut through the commotion as he stepped inside, his expression serious but softening slightly when he spotted her. "Yes, that's me," Naomi replied, halting at the foot of the staircase. Richard's face twisted with disbelief. "What are you doing? They think you're confused, Naomi. Tell them this is a mistake." Naomi ignored him. Reaching into the pocket of her robe, she produced a flash drive and handed it to one of the officers. "Here's the evidence," she said firmly. "They were plotting to have me committed so they could steal my house and my money." Fiona stepped forward, her voice rising in desperation. "This is insane! She's delusional! You can't believe a word she says." Detective Miller took the flash drive from Naomi, scrutinizing her for a moment before turning his steely gaze to Richard and Fiona. "You two better have some very convincing explanations," he said, his voice icy. Naomi crossed her arms and faced them directly. "I regained my sight weeks ago," she announced, letting the revelation drop like a bombshell. "I installed cameras throughout the house and recorded everything. You thought I was vulnerable, but you were wrong." The shock on Richard's face was palpable. This can't be true," he stammered, while Fiona darted her eyes around, searching for an escape. "If you want proof," Naomi continued, locking eyes with the detective, "the recordings show everything. The fraudulent contract, the plan to forcefully commit me, everything." Fiona attempted to retreat toward the kitchen, but a nearby officer stepped in her path. "Don't even think about it," he warned, motioning for her to stay put. In the foyer, the team from the mental health clinic began to realize the gravity of the situation. One of the nurses muttered awkwardly, We weren't informed of any legal issues. We were just responding to a formal request." "You're dismissed," Miller cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "We don't need you here." The nurses quickly filed out, leaving Fiona and Richard more exposed than ever. While officers reviewed the flash drive and collected scattered papers, Detective Miller approached Naomi. "What you sent me was enough to bring us here," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "But I need to know if there's more." "Yes," Naomi replied. "In the study, the bottom drawer contains correspondence that proves they've done this to others before." Richard lunged forward, but two officers restrained him immediately. "She's lying! None of this is true!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Ignoring him, Miller signaled for two officers to check the study. Minutes later, they returned with a stack of letters and documents. Miller flipped through the papers, his frown deepening. "Well, it looks like your story holds up," he told Naomi, examining one of the envelopes. "This isn't their first time, is it?" Naomi felt the weight of vindication but kept her composure. "They underestimated me," she said, her voice steady and resolute. From outside, Mr. Fisher appeared hesitantly at the doorway, clutching a rake in one hand, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Is everything all right here, Ms. Naomi?" he asked. Naomi offered him a faint smile, feeling a momentary sense of relief. "It is now," she replied. Meanwhile, Fiona, cornered, finally lost control. "This is all your fault, Richard," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "You were the one who insisted on this plan." Richard said nothing. His face was set in a grim mask, his jaw clenched as the officers cuffed him. "We have enough evidence," Miller announced. "Richard and Fiona, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted coercion. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard shot a venomous glare at Naomi. Leaning in as he was escorted out, he hissed, "You'll regret this." The threat sent a chill down Naomi's spine, but she stood her ground. Richard and Fiona were led out of the house, the rumble of the police cruiser's engine filling the air. Deep down, Naomi knew this wasn't over. Richard's parting words echoed in her mind, and a gnawing feeling told her that their past harbored even greater dangers. The sound of the police car, driving away, signaled that this nightmare, at least in part, was coming to an end. Naomi stood in the doorway of her house, feeling the fresh night air against her face. The weight on her shoulders, built up over weeks of manipulation and lies, seemed to finally start lifting. Outside, Richard was being escorted into the police car. His rigid posture and cold gaze betrayed the anger simmering beneath his mask of calm. Fiona, on the other hand, limping from her earlier fall, pleaded with the officers, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice almost hysterical. "He made me do it. I didn't want this." Richard turned to her, fury blazing in his eyes. "Shut up, Fiona," he muttered, his tone so severe that even the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Naomi watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For weeks, she had endured every emotional blow, every attempt to strip her of her freedom. But now they were being taken away, their masks torn off. Even so, the sense of victory was tempered by the looming shadow of revelations yet to come. "Ms. Naomi?" Detective Miller's voice pulled her back to reality. He stood beside her, holding a stack of documents. "There's something we need to discuss about what we found." Naomi nodded and stepped back inside the house. As she walked through the empty hallway, she felt the silence differently, It was no longer heavy or threatening. It was a silence that hinted at a fresh start. "We found a series of correspondences in the office," Miller said, setting the papers on the table. He flipped through the documents, pointing out letters and contracts. "This suggests that what happened to you wasn't an isolated incident." Naomi stared at the letters, recognizing some of the signatures and names, ones she had overheard in Richard's conversations when she had pretended not to listen. "They did this to other people?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes," Miller replied. "From what we can tell, most of their victims were vulnerable women, elderly, disabled. They had a pattern of targeting easy prey for manipulation and fraud." The revelation hit her like a punch to the gut. While she had known Richard and Fiona were capable of despicable acts, the thought of how many lives they had shattered made her throat tighten. "And you were the first to break free," Miller added, looking at her with something akin to admiration. "Your email gave us exactly what we needed to act before it was too late." Naomi averted her gaze, trying to process it all. She had been a target, yes, but now she realized that her courage in fighting back had prevented others from suffering the same fate. As they talked, the police team continued combing through the house, collecting evidence. One officer appeared in the doorway with a box of items. "We found more cameras and devices in their bedroom," he said, handing the box to Miller. "This confirms the pattern," Miller muttered, jotting something down in his notebook. He turned back to Naomi. "You were smart to install your own cameras, but they were recording too. It seems they were ready to use anything they could against you." A shiver ran down Naomi's spine. She had known Richard and Fiona were meticulous, but their level of premeditation was deeper than she had imagined. Outside, the sound of a car door closing caught Naomi's attention. She walked to the entrance, watching as Fiona, now handcuffed and with a tear-streaked face, was placed in the back seat of the police car. "Please," Fiona screamed, turning toward Richard. "Tell them it was your idea. I just did what you told me." Richard remained silent, his jaw clenched, refusing to even glance at her. "You deserve this," Naomi said quietly, but loud enough for Richard to hear. He turned slowly, his cold eyes locking onto hers for a long moment before stepping into the car. "This isn't over," he murmured, almost inaudibly, but the threat was clear. Naomi took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words land like one final blow, yet she refused to waver. Richard might try to intimidate her, but he no longer held power over her life. As the police car disappeared down the road, Naomi stood there for a few more moments, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. She felt hollow, but also relieved. Back inside, Miller was waiting. He held one last folder of documents, ready to conclude the initial investigation. "These papers will be enough to build a solid case against them," he said. "Still, if you remember anything else or find anything relevant, please contact me." Naomi nodded. "I will," she replied, offering a faint smile of gratitude. The detective hesitated before speaking again. "You've been through a lot," he said gently. "It won't be easy to process all of this, but you have your freedom now." Naomi didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the living room, where the flash drive containing all her evidence still lay on the table. She picked it up, holding it for a moment before placing it in a drawer. As Miller and his team left, Naomi remained alone in the house. The darkness no longer felt oppressive. She walked through the corridors, her footsteps softly echoing, and stopped in front of the living room window. The police car was already gone, but Richard's parting words still lingered in her mind. Naomi closed the door, alone, and listened to the distant hum of the car engine fading into the night. She asked herself, "What will I do with my newfound freedom?" Naomi woke up to the first rays of sunlight streaming through the gaps in the curtains. The light felt different that morning, brighter, more welcoming. For a moment, she lay there, staring at the ceiling, absorbing the weight of the silence. It was a silence of peace, not fear. She got up slowly, each movement feeling like a small triumph. When she opened the window, she let the fresh air flood the room. The breeze carried with it the soft scent of flowers from the garden, and Naomi smiled as she saw Mr. Fisher already outside, trimming the rose bushes with his usual dedication. "Good morning, Miss Naomi," he called out, raising a cheerful hand in greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Fisher," she replied, her voice light. She descended the stairs, feeling the floor beneath her feet as if it were new. The house, once stifling and full of secrets, now felt larger, brighter. Every corner that had once harbored whispers and conspiracies was now an empty space, ready to be filled with something different, something hers. In the living room, she found remnants of the previous night, torn papers, an overturned chair, marks of a struggle that now seemed distant. She knelt and began to pick up the pieces, shard by shard, as if she were also gathering the fragments of her own life. As she cleaned, her mind wandered back over the previous weeks. She recalled every moment when she had to suppress her fear, every deceitful word from Richard and Fiona, and their attempts to break her. But she also thought of her strength, the courage she had discovered when everything seemed lost. After tidying the room, she went to the kitchen and prepared a cup of coffee. The warm aroma filled the air, and Naomi allowed herself to savor every sip as if it were the first time. Each simple act seemed imbued with meaning. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she had saved weeks before. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Nurse Jane?" Naomi said with a smile. "It's me, Naomi. I just wanted to let you know that I'm okay. It's finally over." The nurse exhaled a relieved sigh on the other end of the line. "That's wonderful to hear, Naomi. You deserve all the peace in the world. And if you need anything, I'll be here." "Thank you," Naomi replied. "I couldn't have done it without the support of people like you." After hanging up, Naomi stepped out onto the porch. The wind played with the loose strands of her hair as she gazed at the garden. Mr. Fisher was approaching, holding something in his hand. "This is for you," he said, extending a freshly cut red rose. Naomi took the flower gently, inhaling its delicate fragrance. "Thank you, Mr. Fisher. You've always known how to bring a touch of beauty to the hardest days." "Well, it seems your days will be much brighter now," he replied, smiling before returning to his work. Naomi went back into the house, walking through the halls and imagining what she would do with each space. The heavy furniture and somber portraits Richard had insisted on keeping would be the first to go. She wanted light, color, life. Maybe new paintings, plants, photos of happy moments. In the office, she found the drawer where she had once kept the evidence against Richard and Fiona. Now, it was empty. She sat at the desk and opened a small box where she kept the flash drive that had been her most important weapon. She looked at it for a moment before placing it back in the box and closing it carefully. It was part of her past, something she didn't want to forget, but no longer needed to carry with her. As the day wore on, Naomi made a mental list of what she wanted to do next. She thought about traveling, perhaps visiting places she had always dreamed of, but never had the courage to explore. She thought about inviting friends over, opening her home to new memories, and she thought about how she could help others who, like her, had been underestimated and manipulated. The gentle breeze carried a sense of renewal, and Naomi smiled to herself. The irony of her situation didn't escape her. She had pretended blindness when she had regained her sight, and it was precisely that which had saved her. Now, she saw everything more clearly than ever. By the end of the day, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Naomi walked to the front door. Holding the rose Mr. Fisher had given her, she placed it in a small vase on the entry table. She paused for a moment, looking around, feeling the strength that now seemed to radiate from within her. She murmured to herself, "I see everything now, and what I see is mine." If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen